Kirara has finally been delivered to us here in Genshin Impact, and is not only a real cat girl, but is too a real cat girl that we actually care about. And she seems to have landed quite nicely, as she's quite the strong shielder, and is capable of dealing some pretty solid damage as well. Hi there, my name is Blossums, and today we're going to go over how to build Kirara, her artifacts, and her weapons, as they can vary quite a bit depending on what kind of weapons you actually have available to you, and how you actually want to play her. We got a bit to cover, let's go ahead and get into it. First up, let's go over how Kirara works. Essentially, she is a Dendro shielder, as I said, and this primarily functions off of her elemental skill, which has a press and a hold function. And basically the way these work is whether you press or hold her E skill, you're going to deal some Dendro damage and create a shield for yourself that scales off of your max HP. Now, where they vary is, of course, their cooldown is going to be different, and also the amount of damage that you actually deal is going to be different. So let's go ahead and explain them individually. When you do the press function, you're going to deal some Dendro damage and get the shield immediately, and this only has an 8-second cooldown, which is nice because the shield duration is 12 seconds, meaning you have 4 whole seconds to reapply the shield to Kirara. And there's actually a benefit to that, because when you reapply her shield, it will actually stack with the previous shield if you still have it, and refresh its duration, meaning you can have an even stronger shield than you did before. And that's where the max shield damage absorption comes in here on the actual stat scaling here. So essentially you can press, deal damage, and get a strong shield, and if you still have that shield, you can press it again, get an even stronger shield, and you can just keep that up infinitely, which is really awesome. And it makes her an effective shielder already, because you have, regardless of whether you're pressing or holding, a 100% uptime shield. So what about the hold function? What's different here? Well, as I said, the cooldown and the damage are going to be different. So we actually do the hold function. You turn into the urgent Neko parcel, which is like this box cat, and you can like roam around the field like your Sayu, and whenever you crash into opponents, you deal Dendro damage, and you can even like climb walls and jump in this state. It's kind of funny and fun to do. The damage it deals when you crash into opponents is not super significant, like 47% there, but you also create a shield for yourself whenever you do that hold function still, so you still get the shield there. And when you come out of that urgent Neko parcel state, you'll actually deal the same move that you deal when you do the press function, except it'll have a higher scaler. So you see 145 here on the press, and then when you actually hold and come out of that and deal that same move, you're going to deal 201% there. But a lot of you might be asking, what's the advantage of the hold function here if I just get to deal a little bit more damage, but I don't get to stack my shield, as the hold function has a 12-second cooldown, same as the shield duration, meaning that you're not going to get the chance to actually stack that shield on her. Well, you actually can, and that's going to come from her passive, the Bewitching Betwitching Tails. And the way this works is whenever you're in the hold function and you crash into an opponent, you're going to get a stack of reinforced packaging, up to a max of 3 stacks. And then when you come out of that package state, you're going to get a shield of safe transport for Kirara. And those have 20% of the damage absorption that the shield that you'd normally create would have, and they will actually stack on to whatever shield you currently have. So if you have no shield, you're just going to get a shield from those stacks, which is pretty nice and still a decent shield. But if you still have your shield, it's going to stack on top of that, and it's going to refresh the duration, meaning your shield's going to last a bit longer and still going to be quite strong. So realistically, using the press or hold is mostly a preference thing and going to be up to you for whatever kind of situation you're in. Maybe you want to make sure you apply Dendro to a bunch of people. The hold function might be better for you, but if you just need to get that shield out quick and get to another character or something, then maybe the press function is going to be the best for you. Either one's going to be a good way to do things. Now, time to talk about the elemental burst. The elemental skill is the focal point of her actual shielding. The elemental burst, however, is the focal point of her damage. It doesn't really have anything to deal with her shielding or anything. It just does AoE Dendro damage, and its scaling's pretty high, and it also creates little like a Dendro bombs similar to like Klee or Aloy or something that will detonate after a period of time, and I believe you can suck them up with Animo characters as well, so you can, focus those into different characters. And as I said, the scaling on this is pretty crazy. We're only at level 6 here currently, and it's almost 800% skill damage, and then the cardamom explosion damage is 49.9, nothing too crazy there, but that skill damage scaler is pretty high already, and that's where a lot of her damage is going to come from. Scalers on the E scale are pretty good too, and they're nice and strong, but the elemental burst damage is kind of crazy. Its energy cost really isn't that high either at 60, and its cooldown is only 15 seconds, which isn't too bad. So as I said, this is where a lot of her damage is going to come from, and this is why she's actually a decent damage dealer, is that the scaling on this is kind of crazy and her shielding is good. So good shielding, good damage, what more could you want? Well, luckily her passive provides even more. Every 1000 max HP she has will increase the damage dealt by not only her E skill, but also the elemental burst. And since the shield scales off of your max HP, well, building her for HP is not only going to be increasing the effectiveness of that shield, but increasing the actual damage you're doing. So all around, her kit just kind of comes together to make her a good shielder and a good damage dealer. Now onto her artifacts, and as a Dendro support character, you can imagine that, yeah, she's going to want the Deepwood memory set. This gives you Dendro damage bonus and gives you Dendro shred, especially if you have another Dendro character on the team. Having Deepwood memories on her and then maybe having a more damage oriented set on the other Dendro character is certainly going to be one of the most effective ways to utilize that team. So Deepwood Memories is basically what I'm going to be going with her, as this is going to be the most general use case for teams. Even if you're in like a Nilo Bloom team or something, then you can shred it that way, and then your other Dendro characters can have other sets on, etc, etc. But it of course is not your only option. You can split it up with something like the Tenacity of the Millith and the Vorukasha's Glow for the extra HP stats. That's also a great way to go. You can get 40% free HP there, and that's going to make her shields extra beefy and still contribute to her damage. So that's pretty good too if you don't have a good Deepwood memory set for her or something. And you can also even take advantage of something like the Noblesse Oblige set that's going to increase her burst damage and also provide an attack bump for the entire team, that it's only going to have a 3-second downtime there, because I believe the cooldown on her burst is 15 seconds there. So that's a solid set as well, but for the most part, I would just recommend doing the Deepwood memory set for her. Now, let's go ahead and talk about main stats. As we mentioned before, max HP is incredibly important for Kirara, as it's not only going to increase the effectiveness of her shield, but increase her damage overall. And there's going to be pretty much two ways most people are going to build their Kirara, which is either going to be just solely focused on the shield, a shield bot, or focusing on the shield and still trying to dish out some solid damage. Now, if you just care about the shield, luckily she has a very easy main stat spread to go for, which is just going to be all HP percent, because remember, her shield only comes from her skills, so you don't really need to worry about energy recharge or anything, as that's just where the damage comes from. So if you only care about the shield, then just going full HP percent is all that really matters. Now, if you really want to dish out some solid damage alongside having a pretty good shield, well, then you're going to want to go for some different main stats depending on what kind of weapons you have, or just kind of where your substats lie. And I think the best general sort of main stats you're going to want to shoot for trying to deal some damage as well is going to be something like HP percentage on the Sands, Dendro damage bonus on the Goblet, and then either HP percent on the Circlet or crit rate. You are going to want some crit rate in order to crit as often as you possibly can, in order to, of course, deal some solid damage. But focusing in on HP percent is just as important. So if you have really good crit rate stats and can afford an HP percent Circlet on there, then I think you're solid. I have about 40% crit rate here on Kirara right now. So I'm having the HP percent Circlet here to ensure that my shield is still super strong and that I can still deal some solid damage. And I think generally speaking, that's going to work the best for most weapons, but this can change depending on what kind of weapons you have. But before we get into those, let's just briefly go over substats. The substats that are going to be super important are going to be, of course, HP percentage, and then followed by crit rate and crit damage, and elemental mastery isn't too bad either, as well as attack percent, because attack percent does affect her damage as well. So a little bit of attack percent can't hurt either, but primarily speaking, you're going to be looking for HP percent, crit rate, crit damage, and then attack percent, elemental mastery, or energy recharge as your sort of flex fourth slot there. Now, moving on towards the weapons, this is likely what is going to decide some of your main stats for you, other than, you know, some of the substats and whatnot. And you have a few options here, and unfortunately some of the better ones in my opinion are the 5-star options, the best one being the Key of Kajni Soot, because it just gives you an insane amount of HP, the 66% here and then the 20% there, as well as giving you some elemental mastery. This thing is crazy and just gives her an absurd amount of HP and is going to be the best for Kirara, unfortunately. But a lot of us don't have this, and a lot of us that do have it are likely using it on our Nilos. So If you don't want to do that, what are some other options? Well, you do have another 5-star option, that being the Primordial Jade Cutter. And I really like this one in particular because it not only gives you crit rate, allowing you to ignore needing crit rate substats altogether because it gives you so much, and allowing you to focus on some crit damage substats, but it also gives you attack based off of your max HP, and it gives you a little bit of HP. So we don't really have room to put attack on her kit in general, just because you're trying to cram in some HP in there and trying to cram in those crit rate substats. So getting attack from the Primordial Jade Cutter is extremely valuable, and this gives you a little bit of HP percentage. That's fantastic right there. And this allows you to, you know, even have a crit damage circlet with some good HP substats or something. I would still recommend the HP percent circlet overall, but if you have some good HP percent substats or something, then you could easily have a crit damage circlet or something and still have a really strong shield and be dealing some ridiculous damage. But for those of us who don't have the 5-star weapons or anything, what are some of the 4-star options available to you? Well, unfortunately, there's nothing really too crazy for Kirara in the 4-star category, especially if you're just trying to do shield bot or something. There's really nothing for you because there is no HP percent 4-star sword yet, and that really does suck. But you do have some other options, and those are going to lie in the energy recharge options primarily. The Favonius sword is going to be a really solid option if you have some good crit rate substats, or maybe using a crit rate circlet or something. That's going to allow you to generate some particles. But I think a lot of us are likely going to be using the sacrificial sword because this is one of my favorite options as well, other than the Primordial Jade Cutter, because this not only gives you energy recharge, which is still valuable for Kirara in order for you to get that elemental burst off of cooldown to deal as much damage as possible, but the passive here is very valuable for her because, one, her elemental skill already does good damage in general, but two, if you get to use it again after proccing the passive here, you're going to be able to stack that shield immediately and have a very strong shield off the hop whenever you use her elemental skill, which is really awesome. It allows you to use that elemental skill twice, not only outputting more damage, but also stacking that shield immediately, which I think is really, really good. And I think this is going to be your best 4-star option overall. You can use something like the Festering Desire if you really want to for the extra damage there. But other than that, you really don't have too many options. You could use Sapwood Blade or something for some elemental mastery shenanigans, but other than that, really not that good. Otherwise, I'd really stick with the Sacrificial Sword or the Favonius Sword in general. And if you have some other 5-star options that can accent her kit appropriately, then maybe go for those. As I said, the Primordial Jade Cutter and the Key of Kajni set are my favorites there, and these are really solid on her. I really do like the Primordial Jade Cutter, but the Sacrificial Sword is going to be the best for most. Not to mention that energy recharge is actually still valuable on Kirara if you're trying to deal damage, because you want to get her elemental burst off of cooldown as much as you possibly can in order to use the elemental burst as often as you can, because that is where the majority of her damage is going to come from. And not to mention, so let's dial back to some of the other options here. If you have something like Primordial Jade Cutter or Key of Kajni Sit and you plan to use those, then you are going to want to search for those energy recharge substats a little more. Now, luckily, Kirara is quite good at generating particles and doesn't have too much trouble generating energy for her burst, so you don't need crazy amounts of energy recharge or anything, but a few substats here and there are definitely going to go a long way for getting that burst off of cooldown. But if you have something like the Sacrificial Sword, and not only can you stack your shield immediately, which is good for the shield bob boys, unfortunately you guys don't really have much options, but this also helps you get your elemental burst off of cooldown in order to use it as much as possible. Next up, we'll briefly go over Constellations, and she actually has some pretty good ones here, and she's a 4-star, so you're more likely to get them over time, so I do find them valuable to go over. First up, her C1, every 8,000 max HP she has will cause her to create 1 additional cat grass cardamom pod when she uses her elemental burst, and maximum of 4 extra ones. This is kind of nice. It's pretty cool, especially if you're using her with an animo character that can group them together or something, then that's just extra damage, and that's pretty cool, but otherwise it's just kind of whatever. C2 here, though, is very interesting from a fun standpoint. It's whenever you're in the hold state of the E skill in the urgent Neko parcel state, when you crash into allies, you give them a critical transport shield, which is 40% of the same absorption of the Meowter Kick's normal shield, which is kind of cool. It's a very fun co-op option there. So if you're a fan of co-op, the C2 is really, really cool in my opinion. Then of course the C3 just adding some levels to the elemental skill there. And then the C4 is pretty interesting as it adds an off-field Dendro damage option for Kirara, which I think is kind of interesting. Essentially, whenever you're protected by the Shield of Safe Transport or Critical Transport Shield, which are the ones that are generated from the C2 for the Critical Transport Shield, and then the Shield of Safe Transport is the one generated from the hold function when you crash into enemies. Whenever your characters deal normal charge or plunging attacks, Kirara will perform a coordinated attack using the cardamom pods that will deal 200% of her attack as Dendro damage, and this can occur every 3.8 seconds. So this is kind of interesting because it's an off-field Dendro addition to her that she just doesn't really have otherwise outside of the random cardamom pods that she generates for her elemental burst. I don't think it's too crazy because it's every 3.8 seconds, which is a pretty long time in between when this actually happens, but it is a little bit of additional Dendro application, which is overall interesting. The C5, of course, just adding 3 levels to the elemental burst, and then the C6 is by far the most useful one overall in my opinion, and of course that's why it's the C6. All nearby party members will gain 12% all elemental damage bonus within 15 seconds after Kirara uses her elemental skill or burst. This is a pretty crazy utility, as this just means you can add damage to anybody and everybody on your character roster for that elemental damage bonus. I think that's actually quite good, and you're going to have this bonus up all the time using her elemental skill and burst. This is by far the most useful one. The other ones are just fairly interesting, but none of them feel entirely necessary or really game changing for a kit, other than changing some of the gameplay aspects, especially in that co-op, and adding a little bit of off-field Dendro damage. But overall, I think they're all pretty cool and pretty interesting, the C6 in particular, but certainly not necessary. Now I'll go ahead and show off my Kirara, and I'm going to be showing you guys 2 different builds. First up, we'll go ahead and show the more daily driver version of Kirara that I'm realistically going to be using more often, and it also happens to be sort of the more budget-friendly version of her. And then I'll show you the more juiced version that has like the 5-star weapons and stuff, because in all honesty, I'm lazy and I don't like swapping my weapons and artifacts all of the time between characters. So I'm not going to be swapping the Key of Kajni set all the time or the Primordial Jade Cutter onto her because, well, I am just lazy. So first up, that's sort of more daily driver version, and this is the sacrificial sword with the double HP and the Dendro damage bonus that I mentioned before. This puts her at 28k max HP, only 1000 attack, which is pretty low, 169 in elemental mastery, which doesn't matter too much. I have a crazy amount of energy recharge at 186. I realistically don't need that much energy recharge. I think 150 is more than enough for her overall. I just happen to have some energy recharge subsets, and then the crit rate and crit damage here ends up at 48 and 80, which is a pretty solid ratio. I think it is a good place to aim to have your crit rate and crit damage, especially if you're still wanting that shield to be extra strong and having the double HP there. Then I think this is a solid place to be. And she does some solid damage in this way, especially with the 61.6% Dendro damage bonus there. Evening out to a pretty solid build overall, allowing her to have a decent shield and be able to put out some decent damage. Now, let's show the crazier version of her with the 5-star weapon. First off, I'll just show the Key of Kajni Soot version, which honestly, the artifacts don't change much here for me. I think I could alter the crit rate and crit damage a bit with, crit rate or crit damage circlet, and I think that would be a good idea to increase some of the damage output there, but I mostly wanted to emphasize the change in the HP here. I really actually just put on the Key of Kajni Soot, and, well, it took my HP from 28,000 to 37,000. It's an entire 10k difference, and the attack is at 1200, an extra 200 just because the base attack there on the weapon is so much higher. So yeah, the difference in the Key of Kajni set in a normal 4-star weapon is pretty crazy just because it gives you that much HP percentage. So the Key of Kajni set by far gives us the most HP for the strongest shield and is still tacking on some of that damage because of her passive that increases the damage via the max HP. But let's show off the Primordial Jade Cutter version, and you'll see here my max HP is actually a little lower, 2,000 lower than the Sacrificial Sword version where I had the double HP main stats. That's because I got rid of one of the HP main stats and added a crit damage substat, so I could actually have a bit more crit damage. And you'll see the results here are that my crit rate and crit damage are by far much higher because of 87, 165 here, 135 energy recharge with the 61.6 Dendro damage bonus there. So my shield here is still solid, and my damage output is substantially higher, and my attack here is nearly 1500, which is pretty good and the highest attack that we have so far. And that's why I like the Primordial Jade Cutter so much, is because I can still have some solid HP while dishing out some ridiculous damage. The only part that I'd say is a little lacking here is probably the energy recharge. I'd like a little bit more to make sure I'm getting that burst off of cooldown a little bit easier. That 150 spot, as I said, is a pretty solid spot to be in. But other than that, I think this is a really solid version of Kirara that is definitely going to be dealing the most damage. Well, that's going to be about it for this video. Hopefully this helped you build your Kirara, and there's no team section in this one in particular because I actually plan to do a dedicated Kirara team video, so if you want to see that one, you know, subscribe to the channel. If you just want a brief tip, if you need a Dendro shielder, then Kirara is going to be on the team. She's just the best Dendro shielder. But as I said, that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully it helped you out. Let me know how you're building your Kirara, what kind of weapons you're actually going to utilize to take advantage of her kit, as I'd like to see all of that down below in the comment section. But other than that, hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.